This is our second meeting reading Simondon's Individuation in the Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're continuing with the Foreword by Jacques Garry. So we saw a little bit last time. It's sort of a preview of the book itself. But we did see, in terms of, I guess, the distinctive theses of the Foreword, he connects Simondon's ideas with those of Merleau-Ponty, and in particular suggests that Simondon had access to some of Merleau-Ponty's late ideas, even though the text itself was not published at the time that this was written. But he suggests that through oral exchange of ideas, he might have access to those ideas. We also saw that Garry argues that Simondon is not a physicalist, or what he's doing is not a physicalism, which I think is a contestable point, but we'll have to evaluate that as we read through the book itself. So we're on Roman numeral 22, and I don't remember exactly where we got to on the page, so I'll just start from the first full paragraph on that page, starting, "This is a situation. This is a situation that confers onto relations a charge of being that exceeds and overflows the order of strictly logical knowledge and significations, and it allows us to avoid the dualism between the act of abstract intellectual knowledge and the inert objects on which the cognitive act bears. How is this pitfall avoided? First, by conferring a dimension of being onto the relations traditionally treated in strictly logical terms, as can be seen at work in the classical theories of deduction and induction. Second, by treating the operation of transduction in conjunction with that of individualizing form-taking, which manifests the passage from the pre-individual metastable fields to individuations in formation. Let's examine the first point. The relations between the fields of extreme tensions of the metastable system charged with potentiality have the status of being, to the extent that the differential values between what can no longer be qualified by pre-existing terms are not yet individualized, but correspond to the dimensions and scales of tensions from which the resolving energy of the system emerges. According to this perspective," and this is a quote from Simondon, "relation does not spring forth between two terms that would already be individuals. Relation is an aspect of the internal resonance of a system of individuation. It belongs to a system state. This living being, which is both more and less than unity, conveys an interior problematic and can enter as an element into a problematic that is vaster than its own being. For the individual, participation is the fact of being an element in a vaster individuation through the intermediary of the charge of pre-individual reality that the individual contains, i.e., due to the potentials that it harbors." So this is dealing with one of the sort of key theses that comes up in the introduction to the book itself, that we'll hopefully start today. But it's the thesis that relations have the status of being, or introducing this conception of relation. So the term relation is going to be used by Simondon specifically for relations that have this status of being. So it's not, rather than having two already constituted terms that then subsequently come into relation with each other, there's going to be an understanding of relation as something that constitutes the being of the terms related.
I was just going to say, I think this will become clearer when the intro starts to get more into...
Is this different than an interdependency?
Yes, I think it is different. So an interdependency or interrelation would be something like two terms that each determine each other in some way. So you'd have the terms themselves would exist, but their properties would be determined by each other to some extent. I think what Simondon is presenting here is a more internal conception of relations, so that the terms themselves arise out of the relation. So in the sense that we start from a pre-individual field of some kind, and then the terms are sort of precipitated out of that field, and then the relation between them subsists through that pre-individual that remains behind after the individuation process. So there's a much more internal conception of a relation, or a conception of an internal relation.
So is it the field that has something that creates the relation, or where various attributes that arise within the field that allows these two entities to relate? Or is there a kind of inheritance that's there in the morphism, or is there something else?
So we'll see this in more detail when we get to the introduction itself. So I don't want to sort of go into this too much here, because we should get to that today. But the general idea is that we start with this pre-individual field that subsequently undergoes the process of individuation, but that process of individuation is never complete, so it never exhausts the reality of the pre-individual. There's always an element of the pre-individual that's left behind by that process of individuation. So then the relation between individuals, the relation in the strong sense, in this internal sense that Simondon is developing here, only ever proceeds through that the remnant of the pre-individual, and through that process of individuation. So it's not two terms that already pre-exist the relation. It's the terms themselves are constituted by that relationship.
I was just saying before, I think this will become a lot clearer when we start talking about his ideas of information, which comes up in this foreword and also in the intro.
Right, and we saw a little bit about this, I guess 2 weeks ago, when we were reading the form information potentials, the dialogue portion of that. So he discussed his notion of information and his idea of a attention of information, so a qualitative aspect of information that's distinct from the purely quantitative aspect that's measured in information theory. And so to some extent, or in one sense, what he wants to explain is the generation of the information in the first place before it can be transmitted through a communication system. So information theory, in the traditional sense, only deals with already created information and discusses how it's transmitted. But then Simondon wants to take a step back from there and look at how the information is generated in the first place. So yeah, that's something, again, that we'll also see more of as we get, probably not today, because I think it's towards the end of the introduction, but yeah, we'll see in more detail as we get to that point.
I think this is going to be a really interesting part of reading this book, is this whole idea that the pre-individual state sticks around after the individuation happens. You know, I'm looking forward to seeing what his examples of that are, because that's a really difficult thing to think about, and I think is one of the most interesting parts of his theory.
Right. We'll especially see more of this much later in the book when we get to the portion on psychic and collective individuation. So that's not for a while yet, but there's going to be discussion of the way that those two forms of individuation involve the relationship between the subject and the remaining pre-individual element in the environment.
And this has huge implications for understanding Deleuze's idea of desiring machines, and the fact that if the desiring machines are this pre-individual level, then how those stick around after the individual is produced, that's the same problem. And so, what we really want to understand, at least I want to understand, is how Simondon informs what Deleuze is talking about that's not in the Deleuzian text.
Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of places within Deleuze where he's drawing on Simondon without even necessarily mentioning him explicitly. There are places where he does cite Simondon explicitly, but there are other places where there's concepts drawn from Simondon that are being used without an explicit reference. But I think at the same time, so first, yeah, it is useful to if you want to have a better understanding of Deleuze, it's useful to understand Simondon. But at the same time, I also think there's a certain danger of a sort of retroactive reading of Simondon, sort of taking him as like a pre-Deleuze almost, and rather than sort of trying to understand him in his own right. So I think the comparisons with particular aspects of Deleuze's work can be useful sometimes, but also can be misleading if we sort of extract individual elements from Simondon and don't understand them in the context of Simondon's general philosophical project.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have to take Simondon on his own basis completely. But the other thing that I'm interested in finding out through this reading is what's the relationship between Simondon and Bataille and the whole idea of the difference between the general and restricted economy. Did Simondon know about that, and was he trying to use that, or is his theoretical system completely separate from that?
As far as I know, there is no explicit reference to Bataille in Simondon. But yeah, I'm not sure. It would be interesting to try to dig up, whether there was whether Simondon might have been aware of Bataille at the time. I'm not sure how widely read the accursed share was at that time, and I can't remember the exact publication date, so I'm not sure if he would have had access to that as he was writing this book. But I do think it would be interesting to try to make a connection, even if there's no direct historical influence.
And then just briefly, do you know? I understand that Simondon was the student of Merleau-Ponty. Do you know how much Merleau-Ponty influenced Simondon?
I sort of briefly mentioned this. I think you might not have been here, but we saw that last week. There were one of the first portions of this foreword. He discusses his understanding of what Merleau-Ponty's influence was on Simondon, and in connection with some of Merleau-Ponty's last works, The Visible and the Invisible, the notes that were published after his death. I tend to think it's probably not quite as direct as Garelli does. I think Simondon maybe borrows a certain or takes on a certain general orientation from Merleau-Ponty and the sort of Bergson tradition within French philosophy. But I don't think he adopts much in the way of concrete philosophical positions from Merleau-Ponty. So I don't think there's a strong sort of direct link between their two philosophical projects.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me know that. I was just wondering.
Go back to the pre-individual briefly. It almost sounds like Simondon here is resurrecting the notion of an ether, something like that.
I think, well, in a sense, in the sense that yes, so he's talking about something that a sort of something that pervades space and underlies the constituted physical objects. So in that sense, you can compare it to the ether. But I think what he's drawing on more specifically is the notion of a field, a physical field, because he connects the notion of the pre-individual with the notion of potential energy. So the pre-individual state is a state in which there is this potential energy that can bring about a transformation and produce individuation. So I think the comparison, the better comparison would be with the notion of a physical field.
Can I propose that we continue through the text and that I read the next two paragraphs?
Yes, I think that sounds like a good idea.
According to the second point, transduction, in strict solidarity with the discharge of the supersaturated potential energy of a metastable system, will appear as a form-taking, and on this basis in the conjoined twofold topological and noetic sense as information, since through the very movement in which a process of transduction, the correlate of the discharge of pre-individual potential energy of a metastable system, topologically informs a structure which is given to be witnessed and to be thought, we can see that it noetically informs about what it makes appear and according to its associated pre-individual charge, i.e. the horizon of pre-individual being from which it detaches. That this is why transduction, in contrast with induction and deduction, which do not have the status of being, but are strictly logical relations exterior to the pre-existing terms that they link up, manifests as never exterior to the terms that it brings forth, according to a twofold dimension of thought and being. As an individualizing movement of knowledge, but also a movement of being, transduction is a form-taking in conjunction with the energetic discharge of the metastable system that is revealed as being more than unity and more than identity. On this basis, transduction is therefore not merely the reasoning of the mind, it is also intuition, because it is that through which a structure appears in a domain of a problematic as providing the resolution to the problems posed. But contrary to deduction, transduction does not go elsewhere to seek a principle to resolve the problem of a domain. It extracts the resolving structure from the very tensions of this domain, just as the supersaturated solution crystallizes due to its own potentials and according to the chemical nature that it holds, not with the contribution of some foreign form. Transduction is a discovery of dimensions whose system makes the dimensions of each of the terms communicate, such that the complete reality of each of the terms of the domain can become organized into newly discovered structures without loss or reduction.
So this here we have another of the key theses introduced in the introduction, which is that this transduction, as opposed to deduction or induction, transduction has this sort of dual dimension to it. It's both an operation of thought and it's an operation in being, in reality. So there's the transductive process that happens in the physical field in the pre-individual, and generates an individuated being. And then there's also a transductive process that happens in thought, and it's through that transductive process in thought that we come to know the transductive process in reality. So he's going to use the expression in the introduction. He says that we know transductive processes by performing a transduction in our knowledge. So our knowledge itself undergoes individuation in the same way that the entities undergo individuation. And then he also, as we see in this passage that's cited from Simondon, he characterizes transductive knowledge as intuition. And that is, as Alyosha mentioned in the chat there, that's a direct reference back to Bergson, who argued for, or who had this concept of intuition as the particular way of knowing duration and the inner experience of time. There's some discussion of intuition and transductive knowledge in the conclusion on the mode of existence of technical objects, which I would encourage people to go and check out as well, because he gives more. It sort of summarizes the conclusion, sort of brings it back to this book as well.
I really like this bit, and I really like that the Bergson connection is obviously there. And I think, as I said before, this feels like he's responding to and expanding on what I think Bergson was kind of accused of as being of vague, like a certain kind of vagueness in what are the actual operations of this intuition that you speak of, that he was always charged with. But I keep thinking that I think the notion of information, like you said, it's going to come up more in the intro, but I really like the way that he's trying to make this move by saying that what we call information, as we're used to thinking of it as sort of abstract points or like human reliance, sort of like, well, this is our observation about how a system works. But he's kind of making the argument that what, that information, that the things that we call information are actually things which have an ontogenesis, that they've taken form in a particular way, and they only exist because of the result. They're a point of tension as a result of other tensions, I guess. So one example that came to my mind was we always think of on a tree stump, like the rings of the tree stump indicating the years of how old the tree is or something. But in a sort of simplistic sense, you can just say, well, that tells me how old the tree is. That is information. But those rings, on the tree trunk are something that are actually produced through the process of its growth. It's not just a point on a graph or something, and it's also, we only see it after we chop the tree down. So it kind of funnily works in that Bergsonian way of like, we have to immobilize it in order to see it. But that just like whether it's temperature, like with the supercooled saturated liquid, or any other kind of way of measuring what we would think of as information, that it only becomes known to us insofar as it itself is a form taking a resolution of a problematic between disparate orders, whether in physical individuation or living individuation, which I think he says happens differently. But I think it's really, really helpful.
And then for people who maybe are not following the chat, there's some interesting points here about this notion of transduction being drawn from Jean Piaget. I wasn't aware of that actually, so I'll have to look into that more. So there's some interesting quotes in there we can take a look at after the session.
So this is an interesting reference to the pre-Socratics. Being and thought are one. That's Parmenides. And makes me think of Heidegger in some ways, maybe similar project. It's almost like we have Heidegger here without the poetics, or the poetics maybe are substituted by technics.
Yeah, the relation between Simondon and Heidegger is something that I think would be interesting to look into more, because I think maybe in on the mode of existence of technical objects, there might be one or two explicit references to Heidegger, But there's also the whole third part of the book has to do with different modes of being in the world, which I'm pretty sure is a reference to Heidegger. And so I think it would be interesting to try to characterize, have a better understanding of what the relationship is precisely between Simondon and Heidegger.
Yeah, I think the tendency in French thought seems to be to kind of materialize phenomenology and to integrate it with natural science. Because Heidegger, of course, would say, science is a kind of derivative and it's the downfall of being and whatnot. But the French don't seem to think so.
Yeah, certainly Simondon doesn't think so. So he will, throughout this book, rely very, very heavily on natural sciences, physics, and biology in particular. And we saw this a little bit in the form information potentials reading from a couple weeks ago. He defends the use of scientific concepts or concepts drawn from scientific domains as paradigms to borrow into philosophy. So this notion of like the crystallization example, using this as a paradigm for the process of individuation in general. So he definitely has a much more positive evaluation of science and the concepts of science than Heidegger does.
I can read the next couple paragraphs. Furthermore, the good form is not the stabilized, fixed form that Gestalt theory believed to locate, but the form rich in energetic potential, charged with future transductions. The good form does not stop making us think, and in this sense, it does not stop generating further individuations to the extent that it allows us to anticipate future individuations. Therefore, the information born out of transductive movements is no longer conceived as the transmission of an already coded and established message sent by an emitter and transmitted to a receiver, but as form-taking. This is topological information, which, on the basis of a field wrought with the pre-individual tensions of the very movement in which the form is individualized, informs in the noetic sense the same thing as what appears topologically and from which it detaches. This is a timeline, a world line, which points toward a pre-individuality of being, in which is the source and the origin of the latter. In this sense, information is a theater of individuations. This involves a situation that cannot be understood except within the framework of the passage of an energetic problematic of metastable states to states in the process of stabilization, which afterwards are in a state of resolution, but also of energetic impoverishment, just as volcanic rocks in the splendor of their individual forms manifest the energetic death of an anterior lava flow. Furthermore, the pure form, the good form of Gestalt theory, is a stabilized energy that has arrived at the end of all its processes of individuation and transformation. The same can be said of the pure and completed pictorial form, which is outlined in the horizon of the quasi-illegible muddle of anterior sketches, such as the admirable preparatory sketches of drafters that allow the quill to run, forming the pre-individual matrix for future beginnings. On this basis, the design is a metastable field wrought with tensions from which progressively emerge the lines in which the individuating forms stabilize. Nonetheless, these forms will be able to again become energetic capacity if they are paired with other forms and if they are integrated into a more complex structure in which they will compose as energetic potential into phases of tensions and a quest for resolution. The act of the painter in direct grips with this field of colored and linear metastability is a theater of individuations. Should I just read the next short paragraph?
Sure, go ahead.
Such is the situation, for example, of a fragment of a bust photographed in a collage, which in itself possesses a fixed form of a fragment of stable reality, indexed and defined by a name, but which, once it is integrated into the new system, takes on a value of a potential charge whose enigmatic dimension is relative to the metastable whole of the composition. However, in this metastable system, in a phase of internal resonance, it is the enigmatic characteristic of form-taking introduced by a foreign element that remodels the whole by making questions emerge. This is what indicates that questioning is crossed chiasmically on the meta-unitary structure of the composition, charged with the potential for inexhaustible forms and meanings. Thus, form-taking in the topological sense of the term, through its structural metastability charged with unresolved tensions, reveals topological information and noetic information tightly interwoven and held in an overlapping chiasmus. Moreover, Gilbert Simondon's meditation focuses on the non-identitarian world, where individuations always reflect an underlying field of pre-individuality that is most often unapparent or forgotten. And it is precisely this inexhaustible enigma that Simondon attempts to contemplate.
Yeah, so there's this notion of chiasmus. It's too bad that Triad isn't here today because he could probably explain this better, but this is a notion drawn from the late Merleau-Ponty in The Visible and the Invisible. And it has to do with this notion of how the body is a form or flesh, as he puts it in that book, is an interlacing of subject and object, or of the knowing and the known. They're sort of they can't be separated from each other in the body or in flesh, and so there's the term is borrowed from poetics. There's a certain poetic structure called a chiasmus, where you have basically a sort of interlacing pattern within a poem, and that's where it's drawn from. But maybe someone else who has a better knowledge of Merleau-Ponty could help explain that a little more.
Well, the paradigmatic example I've heard is the left and the right hand touching one another.
Right. So this is an example that Merleau-Ponty uses, where if one hand touches the other, you can alternately experience each hand as touched or touching. So one hand is the touching hand, and the other hand is the hand being touched, and you can sort of switch back and forth from one to the other. So there's this the chiasmus, as I understand it, is sort of like the neutral point of this opposition. It's the way that the body is sort of underlies the distinction between subject and object, or the way that the body can alternately be the touching or the touched. So I think that's a bit of what this notion of chiasmus is supposed to do.
Is it then, is it an idea of like the body as a site of virtual potentials then? Is that where it's going?
I'm not 100% sure, because so this notion of chiasmus is not one of Simondon's notions, or it's not a term that he uses. So Garally here is introducing this term from Merleau-Ponty to explain what Simondon is doing, and so this, I think, is connected also to his general interpretation of Simondon as being more in the lineage of Merleau-Ponty. So it's I think here it's not referring specifically to the body. So he used the term in relation to questioning. So a questioning. Sorry, I'm looking at the French here, but questioning crossed in a chiasmus on the meta-unitary structure of composition. So it's not so much the chiasmus here is operating in the realm of questioning rather than being something having to do with the body specifically.
I guess I'm just looking at that phrase, held in an overlapping chiasmus. It sounds sort of like the field, the internal resonance maybe would be how someone would talk about it. like, but that the internal resonance that does happen within, I want to say within an individuated being, but within whatever that field is that has the pre-individual, individuated, and the milieu all together, which in living being would be like, if we don't call it the subject, like just the living being, right?
Yeah, we'll see. Again, this is something that will come up more in the introduction itself, and then later on in the book. But we'll see much more extensive account of vital individuation, so the individuation of living beings. But I think to some extent there's I'm a little bit reluctant to make it too close of a link with Merleau-Ponty and his notion of the body, precisely because of the phenomenological basis of Merleau-Ponty's work, and the idea of constitution and so on, which I think doesn't really apply in Simondon's work. So I think the comparison would be you'd have to dig in more to the details of Simondon's development of vital and then later psychic individuation in order to make that comparison. I think you would find the comparison at that point rather than at the point of sort of first principles where we're at right now.
It seems like the notion of intentionality is left out here, and that's still in Merleau-Ponty. I'm not sure about his later work, but in what everybody reads of him, sort of a vestige of Aristotle, I guess, going back to Brentano.
Yeah, so that notion of intentionality is the sort of the key notion of phenomenology when Husserl borrows it from Brentano. And I think you're right that it's not one of the key words for Simondon. And even when he talks about psychic individuation, there's no discussion in particular of intentionality, as far as I can recall.
I just pasted a little bit from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They have a little bit on chiasm that might be helpful for folks.
So I think we can go on to the next couple of paragraphs that someone else would like to read.
So we're on to the crisis of understanding in the physical sciences and its consequences in the philosophical conception of beings. Nonetheless, an interrogation remains concerning the usage of theories borrowed from thermodynamics and quantum physics in the philosophical problematic of the pre-individual and the contemporary conception of beings. Without discussing the properly technical aspect of the problem, it is nevertheless necessary to recall the complexity of the debate, and it is important to reflect on the exemplary prudence of Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg each time they have tackled the question concerning the philosophical status, which could also be called the mode of being of the quantum particle. This question of ontological consequence was central to the meditations of these physicists. It is also worth recalling the end of the conversation between these two scientists, which concerns the notion of understanding in modern physics. This is a problem that is also our own, not just as soon as the question of beings is posed, but also as soon as the philosopher, acknowledging that the dominant state of nature is not matter but energy, calls into question the capacity of our mind to understand the components of this phenomenon. Thus, the pressing question formulated by Heisenberg, quote, if the inner structure of the atom is as closed to descriptive accounts as you say, if we really lack a language for dealing with it, how can we ever hope to understand atoms? Bohr hesitated a moment, as Heisenberg reports, then said, I think we may yet be able to do so, but in the process, we may have to learn what the word understanding really means. It is by having this attitude of circumspection present to the mind that we can attempt to evaluate it. And this attitude is no less prudent in Simondon when he refers to the theory of quanta and to the possible usage of wave mechanics in the clarification of the pre-individual problematic. The crisis of meaning that has shaken the scientific and philosophical problematic of the 20th century cannot avoid these questions.
So this is, again, stuff that we'll get to in the introduction and then in the first part of the book, but there's some discussion of quantum theory and wave mechanics, and So we'll see in the introduction, Simondon argues that this the complementarity of notions within these theories. So the fact that we have to represent something as both a particle and a wave at the same time, or alternately one or the other. So he argues that concepts in the proper sense only apply to what is individuated, and that's why our concepts, when we try to apply them to this pre-individual level, we end up having to use pairs of concepts, and so this intuitive knowledge or transductive knowledge of the pre-individual would be more fundamental than a conceptual knowledge, which is knowledge of the already individuated.
I'm by no means an expert myself, but just with the wave stuff as well, I think you start to get into ways of solving the problem, again, with the question of information, of like, there's a really bizarre but frankly very, very interesting series that was linked in the Bergson group of a 50-part series on YouTube of this professor giving this argument about how Bergson kind of like predicted a holographic theory of perception and stuff. But one of the interesting things I was like looking at with those lectures was the way that they discussed the concept of holographic waves, how waves work in terms of the information that you can reconstitute out of them, and the way in which at any point of the wave that is produces the holograph, you can reconstruct the entire image, and it's no matter which point you take that so-called information from. I'm not saying Simondon is like advocating a holographic universe or something. What I'm saying is just that small insight from my tiny brain helped me think about one of the other reasons why this point in science and philosophy was so important, like when he was writing this, and thinking about what kinds of problems waves can solve that like he said, that notions of just stable or matter at rest, the kinds of badly posed problems that you get into when you only discuss things in that way.
Right. So not to hijack the discussion or get away from Simondon, but those videos on the holographic aspect of not only reality but the brain, they're pretty radical in the sense that at some point they will refer to the brain as a wave, and so it's very abstract and not easily digestible ontology around the holographic nature of being. But with Simondon, it seems very interesting that so much science is being infused into his philosophy, and yeah. But on the point about waves and our perception, that if certain things are out of phase, that they no longer retain their particular form. So I think the chiasmus, which also refers to chirality in chemical structures, at some point it seems like Simondon is going to start talking about these various phases, as was mentioned earlier too, because I'm interested in what those are. But without getting too off topic, I just wanted to, kind of tie a few things together there, entangle.
Yeah, I don't recall if Simondon. I don't think Simondon ever explicitly mentions the notion of chirality. But yeah, it might be worth investigating whether there's some connection with the chiasmus. But yeah, so we can go on to the next couple of paragraphs. If we can get a volunteer.
Thus, after having contested mechanism and energeticism, which remain theories of identity that cannot, on this basis, completely account for reality, Simondon notes the insufficient nature of the theory of fields added to the theory of corpuscles, just like the conception of the interaction between fields and particles, due to the fact that these attitudes remain partially dualistic. Nevertheless, according to Introd'n, they allow us to regain our bearings toward a renewed theory of the pre-individual. Here again we find Introd'n returning to the theses that Bohr elaborated regarding the complementarity of the theory of quanta and of wave mechanics, and where Introd'n, via a new path of exploration, tries to see the convergence of these two new theories, that of quanta and that of wave mechanics, which to this very day have remained impenetrable to one another. In fact, it is a question of envisioning these two theories as two ways of expressing the pre-individual through the different manifestations in which it intervenes as pre-individual. According to this methodological approach, Introd'n notes, by way of another path, the theory of quanta grasps this regime of the pre-individual that surpasses unity. An exchange of energy occurs through elementary quantities, as if there were an individuation of energy in the relation between particles, which can in a sense be considered as physical individuals. It is in the framework of this hypothesis, integrated into what he calls an analogical philosophy of the as-if, that this philosopher proposes to conceive, below the order of the continuous and the discontinuous, the quantic and the metastable complementarity, the more than unity, which is the true pre-individual.
So this is what I sort of mentioned the last time. I got ahead of myself a little bit, but yeah, so he argues that the complementarity of notions that we find in quantum theory is a result of the fact that concepts are only concepts in the proper sense are only applicable to the already individuated. So when we try to apply concepts to the pre-individual, we end up with these complementary concepts.
I'm interested in what he finds insufficient in the nature of fields, because I'm imagining obviously he builds on it, but fields seems to work much more with kind of what we were saying before, like the idea of internal resonances and whatnot. So I'd be curious in what way, what is insufficient about fields as compared to the theory of corpuscles.
Well, yeah, we'll get to this eventually in the first part of the book, but to my recollection, it has to do with the fields conception and the corpuscle conception are sort of complementary to each other in that the corpuscle is the already individuated entity, and then the field is the pre-individual. But so you have to account for both aspects of reality in order to have a complete theory. So if you only have a field theory, then you don't have an explanation of how individuated entities arise out of that field.
I can continue reading. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think there's no more comments. So yeah, go ahead.
I believe we're at reflecting on the necessity in which physics is found to correct and pair together basic concepts. Introd'n suggests the hypothesis according to which this necessity perhaps translates the fact that concepts are adequate only to individuated reality and not to pre-individual reality. If this is taken into account, no positive physical certainty can give an objective solution to a philosophical problem, such as the one posed by the pre-individual dimension of a primordial there is, from which will be released afterwards a detailed problematic of beings in the phase of individuation, precisely because the act of understanding is crossed chiasmically over the physical field, and because this conjoined structure of being and knowledge poses a philosophical problem that exceeds, through its interlinked structure of chiasmus, a simple problem of a positive style, whatever the time frame of the envisioned scientific theory may be. It is thanks to this framework of thought that the reevaluation of the principle of complementarity stated by Niels Bohr and the signification to be granted to the twofold approach of the physics of corpuscles and wave mechanics, such as Louis de Broglie reformulated it at the end of his life after a simplified presentation to the Solvay conference in 1927, which had been critiqued by the founders of quantum physics, are presented in a new light. On this basis, Introd'n suggests, in addition to the reevaluation of Niels Bohr's principles of complementarity, an original interpretation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle as well as a reevaluation of the introduction of statistical calculus into the mathematical formulation of this principle. It is in this framework of reform that Simondon presents his conception of transduction as the effort of thinking in one and the same unity, the object of research and the movement of knowledge that drives it. Afterwards, taking into account this reform of method, the question that immediately arises is knowing whether the distinction posited by Heisenberg between the effective reality of the quantum particle and the knowledge the physicist has of it does not appear as tainted with a dualism that would be controlled by the methodological privilege granted to the individual unit of the quantum particle, initially considered as the reality to be explained, whereas it perhaps only appears as a possible process of individuation coming from a pre-individuality that would be in a relation of discontinuity relative to the field of its manifestation.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the history of physics that is being discussed here, and we'll see more detail of on this in the book itself. But I think the general idea that Simondon is going to work from is this notion of complementarity. This is exemplified by the way that we have to use particle concepts we have to understand certain phenomena as being both particles and waves in different contexts. And so the wave concept and the particle concept are complementary. Certain physicists understood this as being a sort of epistemological complementarity. So it's just a question of our knowledge only being able to grasp certain phenomena in certain forms. But Simondon is going to understand this as a sort of ontological complementarity. So it's through a process of individuation that something comes to manifest itself as a particle or as a wave.
I'm looking forward to the statistical calculus integration and seeing what happens with that, because in a lot of there's these biological theories being developed now of like the Markov blanket, which is a statistical term that's the sort of like boundary of a self, and there's also a lot of work in like biosemiotics, so it might be a way to think about those new developments. So I'm excited for that too.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so when we get to that point in the book, you'll have to help us to think through those issues. So it doesn't sound like there's any more comments. I think most of us are probably a little bit out of our depth when it comes to quantum mechanics. But I'll continue. I'll read the last bit of this foreword before we get to the introduction. Such are the philosophical and not just epistemological stakes of Gilbert Simondon's questioning. In fact, this non-identitarian conception of beings, which must be returned to a field of primordial metastability, exceeds the framework of a subatomic physics or a problematic of the technical object and of vital individuation. This conception is established following three different axes of research. 1, through the perception of the thing in the world. 2, through the question of artistic creation in its entirety. 3, through the timeless conception of ontological difference, as long as the question of being, as Heidegger teaches, remains that of the being of beings. However, the non-identitarian dimension of beings, in regard to which ontological difference is marked, prevents us from posing this question according to the terms used by Heidegger in each of his works. For what this philosopher took as an individual reality with a fixed and stable unitary nature of intra-worldly beings is immediately revealed as a non-being, non-hence, no thing. This is what unexpectedly introduces the problematic of nothingness at the very heart of the structure of beings, which afterwards are no longer beings. This is a paradox that requires surpassing the question of ontological difference such as Heidegger conceived it. Thus, a whole field of contemporary philosophical research is invited to fundamentally renew the mode of questioning of the thing in its relation to the pre-individuality of the world. Beyond the strictly epistemological character of his undertaking, not the least of Gilbert Simondon's merits was to have drawn philosophical attention to this paradigm shift in thought.
I actually have my doubts about this reading of Heidegger, especially, well, being in time essentially is a work of individuation. So I think the problematic is very much there, only it's addressed in a very different way.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I mean, it's a sort of it's almost in passing the way that he addresses Heidegger, and then he makes reference to his own book, and he says so in one of the footnotes. He says this demonstration is developed at length in his book Rhythm and World. So that's something that I'm not familiar with, but so we'd have to go to that book, I think, to get the full picture that he's developing here. But I think he's referring to actually, sorry, let me just take a look at the footnotes and see which. Yeah, he does refer to being in time. So yeah, it is a little bit surprising that he doesn't account for the role of individuation in that book. But so this reference here to the problematic of nothingness, I think refers more to the what is metaphysics lecture rather than being in time. And the idea here is that so again, this is an interpretation that probably could be contested, but I think the way Garelli is presenting things here is the idea is that philosophical inquiry for Heidegger starts from entities that exist, and then from those entities it passes over to being, which being as a non-thing, something that is not an entity, and that's distinct from every entity, and so this ontological difference introduces nothingness into the structure of the being, the individual entity that is related to being, that has a conception of being, so namely the human being or Dasein. Yeah, so again, this is probably not a Heidegger interpretation that a lot of Heideggerians would accept, but I think that's the conception that Garelli is presenting here. But we'd have to look at his book itself to see if that's accurate.
Can I just do my evangelism thing and read this person if folks don't mind? And then maybe we can do the introduction.
Sure.
I just wanted to share because that this last section, other than the Heidegger stuff, there's a bit of a discussion of transduction. What is the transductive effort of thinking, and this thing of thinking in one and the same unity, the object of research and the knowledge that drives it. I'd have to read a longer thing, but I just so much when reading this stuff, you get the sense of that kind of like subterranean. There's a Bergsonian instinct there that I think Lou talked about as well. And if you want some of the poetry back, I can't remember who said it. Just have a think about this quote here. It's from one of the lectures in Creative Mind. He says, "Intuition doubtless admits of many degrees of intensity, and philosophy many degrees of depth. But the mind, once brought back to real duration, will already be alive with intuitive life, and knowledge of things will already be philosophy. Instead of a discontinuity of moments replacing one another in an infinite time, it will perceive the continuous fluidity of real time which flows along, indivisible. Instead of surface states covering successively some neutral stuff and maintaining with it a mysterious relationship of phenomena to substance, it will seize upon one identical change which keeps ever lengthening as in a becoming, where the becoming, being itself, is substantial, has no need of support. No more inert states, no more dead things, nothing but the mobility of which the stability of life is made. A vision of this kind, where reality appears as continuous and indivisible, is on the road which leads to philosophical intuition." I just thought that is so fitting for kind of where Simone is going. Yeah, that's true. I'm doing the good news with with Bergson. Anywho.
Yeah, so before we start on the introduction, maybe I'll just mention again the conclusion to On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, where he does talk about intuition as the form of philosophical knowledge, but he specifically distinguishes his conception of intuition from Bergson's insofar as for him, so for Bergson, there's no intuition has to do with the experience of time and duration, and it's distinguished sharply from the perception of space, of extended things, and the geometrical perception. So Simondon is going to, for his notion of intuition, he wants to have a conception in which intuitive knowledge can grasp the actual, can grasp the individuated beings, but it grasps them through the process of their individuation. So it's a slightly different notion of intuition that is at work in Simondon.
Maybe we should I should go look at that chapter, because that doesn't sound actually too different from what Bergson says, but I'm interested in to see how Simondon distinguishes his project, because obviously Bergson's is more preoccupied with time above all else, although I can kind of see, while Simondon, it almost is spatial in a way when he's setting up all relations. Like, to me, it just feels like a very, very lucid, like, deepening of what Bergson is doing, rather than, I guess I just don't know. I'd have to see what the actual differences are.
Yeah, we read the conclusion to On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects probably a month ago or so, but I'm not sure if the recordings are up yet. But we when they are, you can take a look at that, or just read the conclusion of the book itself, and the account of philosophical knowledge in there. With that said, I think we can pass to the introduction itself. So would someone else like to read the first couple paragraphs?
There are two paths according to which the reality of being qua individual can be approached. A substantialist path, which considers the being as consisting in its unity, given to itself, founded on itself, not engendered, and as resistant to what is not itself. And then there is a hylomorphic path, which considers the individual as generated by the encounter of a form and a matter. The self-centered monism of substantialistic thought is opposed to the bipolarity of the hylomorphic schema. Yet both of these two ways of approaching the reality of the individual have something in common. Both suppose that there is a principle of individuation prior to individuation itself that is capable of explaining, producing, and guiding it. We are prompted to revisit the conditions of the individual's existence, starting from the constituted and given individual. This manner of posing the problem of individuation, based on the acknowledgement of the existence of individuals, conceals a presupposition that must be clarified, since it involves an important aspect of the solutions that are proposed and embedded in the search for the principle of individuation. Namely, the fact that the individual qua constituted individual is the interesting reality, i.e., the reality to be explained. The principle of individuation will be sought as a principle that is capable of accounting for the characteristics of the individual without a necessary relation with the other aspects of the being that could be correlative to the appearance of a real individuated entity. Such a perspective of research grants an ontological privilege to the constituted individual. Thus, it runs the risk of not actualizing a veritable ontogenesis that would put the individual back into the system of reality within which individuation takes place. One of the postulates in the search for the principle of individuation is that individuation has a principle. In the very notion of this principle, there is a certain characteristic that foreshadows the constituted individuality, along with the properties that it will have when it will be constituted. To a certain extent, the notion of a principle of individuation emerges from a genesis in reverse, an inverted ontogenesis. To account for the genesis of the individual with its definitive characteristics, We must suppose the existence of a first term, the principle, which contains within it the very explanation for what is individual in the individual, thereby accounting for its hexaity.
Right. We have these big, long paragraphs, which are characteristic of Simondon's writing style. So we might have to break up some of them. But yeah, so here he's setting out the problematic that he's going to, or the issue that he's trying to bring to light, and he contrasts his position to start with these two positions, which he describes as substantialist and hylomorphic. So the substantialist position, as we'll see in the next little bit, is the atomistic position. So it takes being, or the entity, to be essentially the atom, which has a substantial existence. The atom just is what it is. And then out of these atoms, they're supposed to compose individuals through the union of these atoms. And then the other position is the hylomorphic position. So this is the Aristotelian position of a relationship between form and matter as constituting the individual. And he, as he'll mention in a little bit, there's different variants of the hylomorphic position. So you can either find the principle of individuation in matter or in the form. So there are different Aristotelian philosophers who took both of those positions, but in either case, it's fundamentally still a hylomorphic position. And then the criticism that Simondon makes of both of these positions is that they, in effect, are presupposing what they're supposed to explain. So by positing this principle of individuation, the principle itself is something that has the character of being an individual. So the individuation process is not explained. You're already starting from something that has the characteristic of an individual. So that's the general criticism of those positions. And so now he wants to set out a position that will avoid that circularity, that will account for the process of individuation without presupposing something individual. And there was a question in the chat from Angus, so asking, in atomism, is there any account of the genesis of the atoms themselves, or are they eternal? And so the answer for classical atomism, Democritus and so on, is that the atoms are eternal. The atoms just are what they are, and only the composition of atoms is something that arises, and composed entities can be formed or disappear. Okay, so I think we can continue with the next bit, starting from actually, maybe one thing before we continue is this term hexaity, which is a medieval a term from medieval philosophy, and I think Duns Scotus in particular uses this term, but maybe someone who knows medieval philosophy better than I do would be able to explain that better. But it has to do, so it literally means the thisness of something. It's for an individual entity, it's the property of being that individual entity. And so this is what Simondon wants to be able to account for, the thisness of an entity.
Yeah, the hexaity, though, points at the peculiarity and particularity of the thing. Right.
Yeah, so you have a dog, for example. It has the form of dogness or doghood or whatever you want to call it. the property of being a dog, but it's also this individual dog. So it's not just a representative of the kind dog. It's this individual dog that has specific properties and exists in a particular place and time and so on.
Yeah, the other thing I'd like to mention is between the substantialist and the hylomorphic paths. One is kind of bottom up and the other is top down. The substance path says that there's some primordial substance at the basis of the individual that gives it autonomy and makes it last, and then that has characteristics like attributes and so forth. Whereas the hylomorphic, you've got a form that is forming content, and that's more like a top-down look at how individuals are created. And I'd just like to mention that Husserl takes that, he differentiates the intentional morphe from the hyle that then produce the mixtures of noesis and noema. So Husserlian phenomenology is hylomorphic.
Yeah, and Simondon will not with specific reference to Husserl, I don't think, but he does criticize the role of hylomorphic thinking in the notion of sensation as the matter of knowledge, and then which has forms imposed on it, the sort of Kantian picture of knowledge as this interaction of form and matter, and we'll see that more a little bit later in the introduction. But so this notion of form and matter applies not just to the individuation of physical entities, but also to knowledge.
But does Simondon treat these two paths as complementary, or are they just two independent paths?
I think they're complementary in a sense. So in the sense that the point, or what he wants to explain, what Simondon wants to explain, is the sort of middle point that neither one of them addresses. So in particular, in the hylomorphic schema, the interaction between the form and the matter is the point that is not addressed by the hylomorphic theory. We have this notion of a form being imposed on a matter, but what exactly that means is not clear. So he calls this the obscure zone. And then conversely, for the substantialist or the atomistic theory, it's the composition of the atoms that is left as the obscure zone. So there's and in the atomistic theory, so the formation of composite bodies in the atomistic theory is a result of the Kleinemann, the inclination. So it starts with atoms falling in the void, but if there was only atoms falling, then there would be no interaction of the atoms with each other. They're all just falling. So there has to be a swerve of some of the atoms so that they actually come into contact with each other, and then form composite bodies. So this Kleinemann, this swerve, is the obscure zone within the hylomorphic, within the atomistic theory. So in each case, there's this obscure zone that is where Simondon wants to start from, rather than leaving it as something that is not properly explained.
And I'd just like to mention that Kleinemann is kind of like one of the sources of the idea of anamorphic objects. It's developed by Lacan and Zizek.
That's something I'm not really familiar with, and maybe you could give a little explanation of what an anamorphic object is.
So an anamorphic object is like in the the painting of the two ambassadors. It's the there's a blob in it, but if you look at it off at an angle, you realize that blob is a skull. And so an anamorphic object is one that you have to take up a particular angle to in order to see the object. And so the Kleneman is that swerve by which you then see something from a different angle.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so it's this. I guess it's a principle that introduces the structure that we're supposed to that's supposed to be explained. So the Kleneman serves as the explanation for the composition of bodies out of these atoms. So that it's that yeah. So it's playing the role of the angle of vision in the view of the painting.
Yeah, so there the view is from non-interacting atoms to interacting atoms. That's a switch in viewpoint.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So yeah. Oh, sorry, Alyosha, did you want to say something?
Well, I was gonna ask if I could read the next section. I was just gonna say I think he gets to Kleneman here. I think it might kind of relate to his ideas of how being falls out of step with itself, but I think we'll probably get to that.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest we should keep going. So yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. But we would precisely, yeah?
Yes, exactly.
But we would precisely have to show that ontogenesis can have a first term as an initial condition. A term is already an individual, or at the very least something that can be individualized and can be a source of hexaity, or fabricated into multiple hexaities. Everything that can be a support of relation already shares the same mode of being as the individual, whether this be the atom, the eternal and indivisible particle, the first matter, or the form. The atom can enter into a relation with other atoms via the Kleneman, thereby constituting an individual, be it viable or not, through the infinite void and endless becoming. Matter can receive a form and establish ontogenesis in this matter-form relation. If there were not a certain inheritance of the hexaity to the atom, to matter, or even to form, there wouldn't be the possibility of finding a principle of individuation in these invoked realities. To seek the principle of individuation in a reality that precedes individuation itself is to consider individuation strictly as ontogenesis. The principle of individuation is then the source of hexaity. Both atomistic substantialism and the hylomorphic doctrine de facto avoid the direct description of ontogenesis itself. Atomism describes the genesis of the composite, like the living body, which merely has a precarious and perishable unity that stems from a random encounter and will dissolve back into its elements when a force greater than the force of cohesion will attack it in its composite unity. The forces of cohesion themselves, which could be considered the composite individual's principle of individuation, are thrust back into the structure of the elementary particles, which exist eternally and are the veritable individuals. In atomism, the principle of individuation is the very existence of the infinity of atoms. It is always already there the moment when thought can become conscious of its nature. Individuation is a fact. Individuation for each atom is the atom's own given existence, and for each composite, the fact that the composite is what it is by virtue of a random encounter. Conversely, according to the hylomorphic schema, when we consider the matter and form that will become the sunalon, the individuated being is not already given. We do not observe ontogenesis because we are always situated ahead of this form-taking that ontogenesis is. The principle of individuation, therefore, is not grasped in the individuation itself as an operation, but in what this operation requires in order to exist, namely a matter and a form. The principle is supposed to be contained either in the matter or in the form, since the operation of individuation is not supposed to be capable of supplying the principle itself, but only of putting it to work. The search for the principle of individuation is finished either after individuation or before individuation, depending on whether the model of the individual is physical for substantialistic atomism, or technological for the hylomorphic schema. But in both cases, there is a dark zone that conceals the operation of individuation. This operation should be considered as something to be explained, and not that in which the explanation must be found. Hence, the notion of the principle of individuation is to be explained, because thought is taken towards the completed individuated being for which it is necessary to account by passing through the stage of individuation, so as to end up with the individual after this operation. There is thus a supposition of the existence of a temporal succession. First, the principle of individuation exists, then this principle operates in an operation of individuation, and then the constituted individual appears. If, on the contrary, we suppose that individuation doesn't just produce the individual, we would not seek to pass quickly through the stage of individuation to arrive at this ultimate reality that the individual is. We would try to grasp ontogenesis in the whole unfolding of its reality, and to know the individual through individuation rather than individuation starting from the individual. Ooh, say that 3 times fast.
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting parts of Simondon's philosophy, the fact that he thinks that the principle of individuation comes kind of after individuation as a process, and so we can't think it a priori or beforehand.
Yeah, so we the starting point here is the presupposition that the individual is the reality to be explained, and once you start from that starting point, then you have this retroactive induction of the principle of individuation, whether it's the atoms in the void or it's the form and matter, and then once you reject that presupposition, once you say that it's not just the individual that has to be explained, but as we'll see in a little bit, it's the individual and their milieu. So the individual and its milieu are coordinate results of the process of individuation. Once we accept that the individual is not the only entity, it doesn't exhaust what is, then we don't have this sort of immediate tendency to have this retroactive production of the principle of individuation, and then we can actually examine the process of individuation rather than sort of skipping over it to get to the individual, like the atomistic and the hylomorphic theories do.
So, in order to get some context, one of the things that could be said is that, in Hegel's idea of the notion, he abstracts from the syllogism the idea that the syllogism is made up of 3 parts: the universal, the individual, and the particular. And those 3 things fuse together into the notion, which is an image of apperception. And so you can see that the individual is assumed in that kind of syllogistic logic from the very beginning. And so what Simondon is really saying here is that we can't assume that individual as given that makes the syllogism work. And so it somehow takes us to something prior to logic, because we can't assume the individual is there to mediate between the particular and the universal.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're going to see in a little bit that he's going to characterize the pre-individual as something that to which the law of excluded middle doesn't apply. So it's beyond the law of excluded middle. And so classical logic would apply to individuated entities, but not to the pre-individual. And on the connection with Hegel, or the relationship with Hegel, I can't remember if this comes up in the introduction at all, but he distinguishes his notion of transduction from the Hegel's notion of the dialectic on the basis of the fact that transduction doesn't have this moment of negation. We're going to see there's a concept of the disparate as playing a role in the transductive process. But it's not a negation. There's no negative moment in the process, and so that's how he sets out his own difference from Hegel.
Can we explain a bit about because actually Kent's example was really helpful, that I put that in chat of we can't assume the individual is there to mediate between the particular and the universal. That's a really great way of phrasing it, and that helps when thinking about something like the Sunalon. But I'm just trying to understand, because what you had originally said was, rather than being before, it's sort of you have to begin it after. But I'm wondering, and maybe I'm getting stuck on the language here, but towards the end of that paragraph, where he says the search for the principle of individuation is finished either after individuation or before individuation, depending on the model. But it seems to me that he's kind of saying both are problematic, because even if you start it after, that's how you fall into hylomorphism. So is it a question of trying to locate the principle after, or simply just that of trying to think with, I guess, not putting the principle of individuation anywhere prior or a posteriori to ontogenesis itself, like that ontogenesis is the thing that needs to be explained. I don't know if I'm losing my words here, but I'm just trying to understand that.
No, I think that's the question that we need to discover as we're the answer to that as we're going through the text, because the way I see it is that what he's saying is that you can't think the individual before you have the individual, so that's a problem. And so he's going to try to describe a state prior to the individual arising, but the kind of brilliance of his argument is that he says, well, I don't have the individual, so I can't think it before it arises. And after it has arisen, then I posit back a principle that would give rise to it, but I don't have that before the individual arises. And so there's a quandary there that I'm hoping that he's going to clarify, and I don't really have an answer to your question.
Not to anticipate too much, but he is going to introduce this term. So in relation to the disjunction between the a priori and the a posteriori. So the a priori being the before, and then the a posteriori being the after. He's going to introduce this term a presenti. So the happening now. So this is coordinated with the process of individuation. So he's specifically talking about, in the case of knowledge there, so the relationship between matter and form in knowledge, and the relationship between a priori and a posteriori. And he's going to argue that those two extreme terms are the result of the process of individuation, which is a presenti, which is happening in the present. But that same structure applies to the physical individuation as well, not just in the sphere of knowledge. So to the extent that we can say that there is a principle of individuation, it has to be a principle which is present, a principle that's present. It's not something that precedes individuation or that follows individuation. It's something that occurs along with individuation.
That's brilliant, because when we talk about a priori and a posteriori because of Kant, but what's forgotten is that the present moment is forgotten in that, and so he's recognizing that, and that's fantastic.
I just want to say too, having thought about it and looking at this sentence as well, it makes sense to me now that he's saying specifically that the supposition of the existence of a temporal succession. So as long as the individual is the interesting reality, like he said on the first page, that you think needs to be explained, then you kind of inherently get into this problem that is almost dialectical, like he critiques later, of there's a principle of individuation, then it operates, and then that is now over, and all you have left is the constituted individual. And so it kind of exists on its own without any support. And I think when he's saying if we don't accept that the individual is the thing that needs to be explained, and we accept that individuation actually produces more than just the individual, and that the pre-individual reality still exists even when the individual is produced, along with the field and everything else, then you can't have just a simple temporal succession like that. I suppose he has an account for it. There is a kind of succession, just like the crystal has a kind of process that it expands in, but it isn't. It's not lost. Which again, I won't get into it, but it feels very Bergsonian. Of like that, you always retain that the duration doesn't mean you lose the previous moment. The past and the present are kind of coterminous and coextensive. So that kind of makes sense to me. And I had forgotten, actually. We even spoke about a presenti last week, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
So if there's no other comments or questions, I think we can go on to the next bit. I guess I can read the next couple paragraphs. Actually, we're getting pretty close to the end. Maybe I'll just read one paragraph and then we can discuss that, and then we'll end there. We would like to show that it is necessary to reverse the search for the principle of individuation by considering the operation of individuation as primordial, on the basis of which the individual comes to exist and the unfolding regimes and modalities of which the individual reflects in its characteristics. The individual would then be grasped as a relative reality, a certain phase of being, which supposes a pre-individual reality prior to it, and which, even after individuation, does not fully exist all by itself. For individuation does not exhaust in a single stroke the potentials of pre-individual reality. And moreover, what individuation manifests is not merely the individual, but the individual milieu coupling. The individual is therefore relative in two senses, because it is not the entire being, and because it results from a state of the being in which it neither existed as individual nor as principle of individuation. Yeah, the footnote there, I have it in the French. I don't know if someone has the English ready to go, but in the French, I'll just sort of translate on the fly. So he says, and a constitution between extreme terms of a intermediate order of size, order of magnitude. The ontogenetic becoming itself can be, in a certain sense, considered as mediation.
So, what's interesting about this is that what he's doing is he's questioning a fundamental assumption of the Western tradition that overemphasizes the individual. And so, it's very interesting when a thinker questions a fundamental kind of principle within the tradition that no one has really thought about deeply before. And I think that's the real value of Introd'n, that he's thinking about that.
Showing the presuppositions of thinking, and especially showing that certain presuppositions are not necessary, is a very valuable task in philosophy. Showing the contingency of the presuppositions that are generally accepted, and Introd'n does that quite well. So I just realized now that I read the wrong footnote because the numbering is different. I'll read it in the footnote. This is at the end of the line. But the individual milieu coupling, then there's the footnote. Furthermore, the milieu may not be simple, homogeneous, or uniform, but it can be originally suffused by a tension between two extreme orders of magnitude that the individual mediates when it comes to be. So we'll see a little bit later more on these different orders of magnitude, but we can think of it. So an example that I like that he introduces later on is the way that a plant integrates or mediates the molecular level, the order of magnitude, with the cosmic order of magnitude by absorbing solar radiation. So the plant is a sort of a mediation between these two poles. So that seems like a good place to end for today. Then just short of 2 hours. thank you everyone for coming and for your contributions. And we'll continue with the introduction next week.